If we're honest, most of us with a logbook full of miles look back on our first solo skippering effort with mixed feelings. Unless we finished up on the wrong end of the lifeboat's tow rope, it must have been a success of sorts. However, if the passage wasn't a broad reach in daylight with force 3, a fair tide, and an easy berth laid on by the angels, there's generally a catalogue of mistakes to balance the books. Happily, so long as we don't nurse the sort of personality problem that turns all misfortune into bad luck or some other cove's error, we can always find time once the lines are secure to take a hard look at any cock-ups and make sure they don't happen again. After a few seasons of this approach, even the most hapless tyro skipper can gain in confidence. My own inaugural trip in charge began badly and soon deteriorated into the red zone, but it produced a good final result. To rack up some experience, I'd been crewing for a delivery agency with an office in Hamble Village. This outfit was an early attempt at a federation of skippers and crews, but in contrast to today's well-regulated examples, it didn't last long. It terminated when I turned up one day to collect my pay, only to discover that the man in charge had absconded. The bearded bandit who stole our wages was never seen again, but his moment of treachery was still far in the future when he offered me a 45-foot twin-screw motor sailor for delivery to the French Riviera. Like me, my crew were in their early 20s. Percy was a North Sea trawlerman whose grip on reality was sometimes stretched by habits he must have picked up in the 1960s. Mick was a merchant seaman with a proper discharge book who fancied a spot of yachting to see what it was all about. At 6.5 feet he was as tall as me. These days he's a scrimshaw artist of international repute. Then he was a likely lad sailing the seas and giving the girls a treat when the opportunity arose. The yacht was beautifully built on motor fishing vessel lines by Millers at St Monans in Fife, and lay lying on the tidal wall at Poole Town Quay. My first mistake was to sail at midnight. Quite why I decided this I cannot remember, but I can tell you that except on occasions of extreme duress, I've never done it again. If there's any choice, I always try and leave in the morning, or at least after lunch. I'm still fresh then, and it gives the hands time to settle into being at sea before clocking into the watch system after dinner. In anticipation of a juicy payday, I took my girlfriend out for a pre-departure curry in Southsea and rounded off the evening with a ride on an instrument of torture on the promenade called the Wild Mouse. This unnatural creation hurled us around like a couple of ball bearings in a bucket. So extreme was the motion that I suffered a bad bout of seasickness before I'd even stepped aboard my ship. The lady had a car and deposited my mortal remains, still green, on Poole Quay as the clock struck 12. Holding on to what was left of my prawn vindaloo with difficulty, I set down the old ship channel towards the harbour entrance. Poole Harbour's well marked these days. Back then, many of the buoys and beacons were unlit, and those that showed a bit of a glim were readily lost in the background blaze of the millionaire's mansions at Sandbanks. I knew none of this, and boldly ran the owner's yacht up on a shoal at 6 knots. I think the tide must have been flooding, because we got her off with engines alone, but it was not an auspicious beginning. My third and cardinal error was not to make a big enough deal about a vital nugget of information passed on by the yacht's previous skipper as he'd handed over. The port engine, he said, had a habit of overheating if it exceeded 1400 RPM for anything more than a brief burst. In my ignorance, I hadn't considered why this might be. I simply accepted it and set out blithely for the Mediterranean. All might have been well, except for the sort of juxtaposition of events that can so easily bring us to ruin. A moderate sea from the southwest caught us as we rounded Anvil Point. I realised that if I didn't get my head down, I was going to say goodbye to the remains of my dinner, so I left Percy on watch, motoring into it at 1400 RPM, and turned in. I mentioned in passing about the revs and the heating issue, but failed to hammer the point home. Shortly before dawn, I awoke to a racket from the engine room like a rivet gun on steroids. Galloping up to the wheelhouse in my skivvies, I found Percy lurking at the wheel, wreathed in thick, oily fumes. The whites of his eyes, framed by his shoulder-length curly hair in the light of the binnacle. A glance at the instrument showed the port engine temperature gauge off the clock. Mick came bounding in as I shut things down, and he went below to take a look. He came back with grim tidings. Things were considerably hotter than hell amongst the machinery, and what appeared to be a conrod had made a failed bid for freedom by poking its head out of the portside crankcase. We clearly couldn't carry on like that, but we still had the starboard engine and a respectable suit of sails, so we set course for Guernsey and quizzed Percy on what had come about to wreck the port unit. He was in a state of shock, but once the smoke had cleared he returned to his unique approximation of normality and told us he'd been buzzed by an unidentified flashing light from the sky, which he'd taken to be a UFO. As it approached, he'd pulled both engines out of gear to lessen the force of the impact if we were rammed by aliens. The flying saucer had circled us twice before making off towards Portland, and no little green men had boarded us, so he got under way again and hoped for the best. Percy was used to big ship telegraphs of the Icelandic trawler fleet, and under attack from space he'd understandably forgotten any mention of 1400 RPM. Instead, he'd simply grabbed our shiny Morse control levers where they stood upright alongside the binnacle and rammed both into full ahead. The boat had surged away at a gratifying 9 knots, but the rest was history. I'd seen these flashing lights in the channel before, and I hadn't the heart to tell Percy that it would have been a military helicopter on exercise, so he limped into Guernsey to call the owner and confess our sins. I've had a number of owners since then, but none has been as kind and understanding. Maybe he was a philosopher who realised that we all are best served by coping with reality as it is handed out to us, rather than fulminating about who's to blame. I don't think my predecessor had told the owner much about the overheating, because he'd been responsible for maintenance, and I later learned that the cause of the problem was a blocked heat exchanger on the Parsons conversion of a Ford 6D. Had he inspected the unit as soon as the overheating became chronic, all would of course have been revealed. But he'd been lazy, and I'd been naive. A new short block was sent out from Parsons to be installed by an engineer in St Sampson's, who took one look inside the heat exchanger and shook his head. 10 days later we were back at sea. The rest of the passage was equally full of incident, involving storm-force winds, Percy overboard, and the miraculous saving of life. But we arrived in good order, and I'm holding all that back for another time. Right now, I'm reconsidering the lessons of the wild mouse, the grounding, my poor communication, and making sure I haven't overlooked anything. After all, it's never too late to learn.